Welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Benchia, the manager of the travel program at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and thank you so much for coming here today to welcome with me Kevin Lane, who lives in Argentina but is here visiting us, and I'm just delighted that he's here to give the lecture today. Dr. Lane is a senior researcher of the National Scientific and Technical Research Council of Argentina at the Institute of Cultures and a professor at the University of Buenos Aires. He was recently appointed a Leverhulme Visiting Professor at the University of Reading, UK. He is a founding member of a Peruvian NGO dedicated to the rehabilitation of ancient technology and a consultant for the Mountain Institute of Peru. His PhD is in Andean archaeology from the University of Cambridge, and he has over 30 years of experience as a field archaeologist. He has had several prestigious fellowships and research projects and directed a project on ancient Andean mobility. And since 2019, he has been director of the Past Water Futures Project, dedicated to the restoration of ancient dams for modern use in the increasingly water-depleted Andes, essentially looking at how past water management solutions can enhance modern community resilience and water security in the present. His full bio is in the brochure that you probably picked up for our next Peru tour, which will be in the fall of 2026, so about a year and a half from now. And please join us or tell your friends about it. This front row here, they all went on the 2022 trip that we did to Peru with Kevin. And we had done over 50 years of having a travel program. We had done some trips to Peru, but we hadn't really had a study leader, had any connections. So I kind of cast the net really wide and asked anyone who I could find who had expertise in that area. And a curator at LACMA told me about him. And I had a list of probably 20 names and then did Zooms. This was 2021, so we were all used to Zoom by then. I talked to about, I think it was either 8 or 9 Peru or South American scholars in art and archaeology, and Kevin was clearly the shining star. We could tell even by Zoom over, probably a 2-hour conversation that he was definitely the one that we wanted to join our program and be part of the fold of the museum travel program community. And he went on the trip with the group, and one of them said that traveling with Kevin is a real treat, and he's just such an enthusiastic, lovable, and brilliant mind, so I hope you find the same. And just some housekeeping, if you could turn off your phones so that no beeps go off during his lecture. When he concludes, we'll do some Q&A, and I have the microphone, so if you'd like to ask, we'll leave room for a few questions. And lastly, when you exit, we'll have some Argentinian wine. There was no Peruvian, but he lives in Argentina. So we have some Argentinian white wine and some San Pellegrino, and then a few taste treats, some corn and plantains and guava little crackers that are inspired by South American arepas. So hopefully you'll join us for some mixing and mingling with Kevin. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kevin Lane.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, after that introduction, I'm feeling rather abashed, but anyway, I'll try and go through this. So for some of you, the front row here, this is old news, most likely, so hopefully you've forgotten about it in the last 2.5 years. So what I want to do here, really, is sort of give you an introduction to the archaeology of South America, and really I'm going to whiz by sort of 15,000 years of archaeology. For Bob, there's going to be a couple of slides. This one in particular, because he likes 4-legged beasts. So these are little Inca llamas of gold, silver, and spondylus shell, but we'll be talking about them a bit more presently. So where does it all start? So we know that Homo sapiens sapiens comes from out of Africa, and actually if you look at how sort of the whole of the world was colonized, the last place to be colonized would have been the Americas, okay? And the what you would have had is you would have had an area of land so that people could have crossed a land bridge up in the Bering Straits, which was called Beringia. And that worked as a bottleneck for a while. And then eventually, once the ice sheets retreated, they managed to break through, and we'll go through the different theories for that, break through at around 16,000 years, and then go all the way down to South America. What we're looking at here are hunter-gatherers, mainly. So you would have had sort of marine adaptations along the coast of California, for instance, and you would have had big game hunters, which would have used, this is what's called a Clovis point or fishtail point because of its shape, and they would have been hunting megafauna like mammoth, bison, etc. And this is what they would have looked like, more or less. I mean, this is a photograph of hunter-gatherers from Patagonia from the late 19th century. So anyway, that's more or less the idea of how they would have gone through. Sort of going into sort of more detail, you would have had at least 3 waves of migration. So the main, probably the first wave, would have been along the coast. So they would have been hugging sort of this land bridge and gone all the way down the coast. And they would have probably reached South America quite quickly. So they reckon that they probably started about 20,000 years along the coast. And by 14,500, they would have gone to the very bottom. This would have been a marine adaptation. Then you would have had the ones that break through the ice, which are these big game hunters. That's the Clovis first paradigm. And then you would have had other waves coming in at around 30,000, 15,000. And the last one, which is much, much later, is the Inuit, which are the Inuits would have gone into the very north, stayed in the very north, and would have colonized all the way up to Greenland. Then there's been other theories, like there's a very, very mad theory by some Brits that people from Europe crossed the ice when all the Atlantic was ice covered. This is called the Solutrean hypothesis, but it's been mostly debunked, but I put it there just so that we have an idea of what happened. And there's this idea that the Americas were very isolated, right? That for years that they sort of developed in isolation. This is not entirely true. We know, for instance, that the Polynesians managed to come all the way from if you got to Easter Island and you just went slightly further east, I mean, albeit 1,600 miles further east, you would have hit a continent, and they probably did. We know that the Vikings came to North America, and we know that in medieval times there were Irish and Basque fishermen that were fishing off the coast of Greenland. The thing with these other migrations is that by that stage, you would have had a quite substantial population in the Americas. So whatever landfall they made, it was never that successful or that permanent. We know that the Vikings disappeared quite quickly, within 50 years, and the Polynesians, if they did make it, well, we do know because there's some genetic sort of drift in some South American populations, they didn't make much of an impact because there would have been quite settled populations in the Americas. But anyway, just to give you an idea of what the colonization was looking like, and actually all the way back in the 16th century, you had José de Acosta, a Jesuit monk, saying that if people came, they must have come in through the north. Okay, so this is thinking about colonizing South America, so you start getting different dates. And the problem with this is actually, because we think that probably the first wave was maritime, most of these sites are now underwater because this was during the last glacial maximum or just after the last glacial maximum. So the coast was probably between 100 to 250 meters or 100 to 250 yards further down, right? Because obviously the ice was capturing everything. So it's very hard to get at these early sites, right? But nevertheless, we have sort of Monteverde down at the very bottom, which is 1400 BC. And there have been some people that say that maybe colonization can go all the way back to 30,000 years, but we really don't have much evidence for it. So when we start really getting strong evidence is by around 1300, 1200, and some like Monteverde, 1600. And do stop me if I'm going too fast or you want something to be explained a bit more. And then once you start getting all the way down to Monteverde, they start colonizing the rest of South America. So if you're thinking about a coastal route, eventually they have to move inland. So the colonization of South America is between 13,000 to 12,000 the Northwest, the Western and Patagonian regions. And then by 1150, they're sort of spreading inland. But actually, the Andes themselves, which are really high and really quite extreme, it takes a bit longer. It takes another, 1,000 years, a couple more nights, and then they manage to make it all the way into the highlands. And this is especially for Bob. So one of the things that does happen with the coming of humans into the Americas are mass extinctions. Okay, so some animals completely disappear, but some disappear and some thrive, right? So it's probably a combination of different things which are happening. So actually, I don't know if any of you knew, well, obviously you had mammoth here, but the horse originally comes from the Americas. Okay, so the horse was, when the Beringian land bridge was in existence, the horse traveled to Asia, and that's the horses that we get nowadays. Then they became extinct in the Americas, and then they were brought over by the Spaniards. Okay? So when you think about sort of the Plains Indians and so forth, and you think of them as horsemen, you have to also think that the horse had only been introduced about 300 years earlier. And they nevertheless managed to change their way of life quite substantially to incorporate the horse. They do think that it's very likely that the humans did kill a lot of the animals, but the weird thing is that some animals did disappear and some of them didn't. And the reason for that, they reckon, is that some of them were more susceptible to certain diseases that the humans were bringing, or the only domesticated animals that the humans brought, which is the dog. The dog is the first animal to be domesticated by humans, and that's because it was used for hunting. Okay? And that probably also climate had an impact, and that also made the numbers of animals decline. We know that when humans got to Australia, there was a megafaunal extinction there. So it seems to follow a pattern that we go into places, we like our barbecue, we eat the animals, and off they go. And what we do know is if you look at the Andean people through time, there are certain particularities, because obviously these populations are small populations that move in and then they spread, and then they're cut off from the rest of the world mostly, aside from these sort of Polynesians and Vikings that come in. So that there are certain traits, which I've put here, so that you have Sudonti and Sidonti tooth roots, more Sudonti in the north and less and more Synodonti in the south. There's the epicanthic eye folds. I won't get into all of this. The mixture is mostly Asian, but there's some Caucasoid, and now we're starting to find in the gene flow even some Australoid genes in it. So at some point, there must have been like a population in Asia that had all these different genetic traits, and from there it spread down to Australia, and some of them came over to the Americas, and you still find them. You still find that genetic flow within the ancient American Amerindian population. What's interesting is that obviously then with the coming of the Europeans, you get Europeans, Africans, and other Asians, Chinese and Japanese coming in. What's interesting is the blood types as well. The indigenous American populations only had two blood types, A and B. There was no O. O was brought in by the Europeans. Okay, so the most common blood type was not in existence until the Europeans came. Now it does exist, but that's through European colonization. And that again shows that the people that initially moved would have been small in number. So when you think about the Andes, so now we're coming down to the area I do like, one tends to think that the Andes are incredibly extreme. But if you start looking at the numbers, which is something I always like, when you start looking at the stuff, you realize that actually, yes, it's extreme, but it's incredibly productive as well. So the Andes are the largest tropical glacier in the world. I mean, it's disappearing, but it's still there. South America contains 2/3 of the world's amphibians, 1/3 of the world's birds, almost half of all the reptiles, 1/3 of the planet's fish, and it's a multivariate ecology that goes from basically the sea to the jungle, sometimes in less than 250 miles. Okay, so it's incredibly varied. It can be incredibly productive if you know how to use the environment. And that's something that the humans that populated these areas knew really well how to do and how to adapt themselves to it. Okay, so one of the things that you have is incredibly rich marine life off the coast in the Pacific. You would have had, from very early on, totora raft fishing. These are the totora rafts which are still used for fishing in the north coast of Peru. And here we have sort of a ceramic vessel showing one of these photographs in the past. And mainly what they were fishing is this Peruvian anchoveta, which is there the whole year round and is very high in protein. These are very small fish, and we find them in archaeological sites everywhere. And the other thing that they were going for is this. This is called the thorny oyster. It's a spondylus, and that's, if you remember the first slide with the little llamas, the little camelids, it's made from that shell. And that was actually because this was considered to be the food of the gods. And the reason this was considered to be the food of the gods is because if you eat it at a certain time of the year, you hallucinate, and I suppose that then you believe that you're communicating with God. And that's what we reckon was happening, but there you go. The other thing is it's so rich, the ocean is so rich that as opposed to other places in the world, the first agriculture that you have is not actually really to eat what you're consuming. It's rather to make nets for fishing. They domesticated cotton for the nets. They domesticated squash to make the floats for the nets. So it's all to do with a maritime exploitation. So it was so effective that you start getting the first glimmers of civilization and monumentalization tied to an agriculture which is really subject to the exploitation of maritime resources. Okay, nevertheless, so that's why it's called the cotton pre-ceramic and the maritime hypothesis. Nevertheless, obviously in the Andes, you have, man has conquered sort of the Andean slopes, and the way they did it, because it is an area which is very accidented and it's very sloped up, they terraced the whole of the Andes, so that you will find terraces all the way up to about 4,200 meters, is about 13,000 feet. Now, the other thing that you have to take into consideration, and I'll be talking about this as well, is that they didn't have any draft animals. So the only way they could do it was with foot plows. And these things are called chaquitaquias, and that's how, these are original, this is how it would have been done in the past, with these foot plows, which in the past would have been made out of lithics, would have been made out of stone. Okay, and we find these. And actually, there's even sculptures made of them, and we'll see them. So we have, for instance, ceramic in the shape of these foot plows, and there's even a massive stone sculpture which is made in the same shape, which we'll see later on. And then obviously, eventually, we get onto the production, food production, and there are some species of plants that only come from the Americas. One of them is corn or maize, the common bean, and the potato. The potato is indigenous to the Americas. It did not exist before Columbus found it, okay? As in, found the Americas. And what's interesting is that when you think about things like the Irish blight, you know, the 19th century Irish famine, which was based on the failure of the potato harvest. So in the same way as the Plains Indians adapted to the horse, the Irish adapted to the potato. And what's interesting is that these things would have been used in different ways in the Andes, so that maize was not used so much for food. It was used to produce chicha, which is beer, which is basically corn beer. And the potatoes, because again, you're looking at really high altitudes in some places above 16,000 feet, you can freeze dry them. So actually the first ever freeze-dried potatoes were produced in the Andes, and these are called chuño, okay? And they look like sort of mushrooms, but actually they're freeze-dried potatoes, which they're frozen in the open air over about 5 days. And then, again, we have a couple of slides for Bob. So there's very few animals in the Americas, and the main animals that were, the four main animals that were domesticated were the guinea pig. So they were not used as pets, they were used for food. Then these are two wild camelids, which are the guanaco and the vicuña. The vicuña produces the finest fiber in the world. It's even finer than cashmere. And then the dog, and the typical Peruvian dog is the viringo, or hairless Peruvian dog, okay? Which people that have arthritis say is really good to have because they're really warm. But they look ugly. I actually quite like them, but there you go. And another Bob slide. So where did they come from? So the camel is another one of these animals that comes from the Americas. And the camel actually comes from North America. It's split into two branches. One went over the Bering Straits into Asia, and it became the Asian and the Middle Eastern or African camel. And the other one went down south, and it's the original species is called the Hemuchenia, and then that, around 12,000 to 10,000 BP, becomes the Paleo-llama, and they're massive. This is probably an archaeologist and a Paleo-llama beside it, and here you can see them sort of in the wild, as someone has thought about how they were. And we, for a long time, we've wondered where they come from. So we have the wild progenitors, which are the guanaco and vicuña, and now we know that the guanaco derived into the modern guanaco and into the llama, and the vicuña derived into the vicuña and into the alpaca. Domestication of these animals occurred probably between 5,500 and 6,000 BP before the present, so that means about 4,000 years BC in the central Andes, okay? And we know this because in these cave sites we start finding young that have a certain disease, and this disease is associated to corralling. And this only occurs when the animals are being kept in stressful situations. And that normally shows that they've been domesticated. That's the first indication that we have, okay? And these critters are really quite lovely. So these are alpacas. Sorry, this is a llama, and these are alpacas. And they are the main, they would have been the main fiber or wool animals. So the alpaca is the one that's used mainly for wool. And the only carrion animal would have been the llama. The problem with this is that if you compare it, and this is, if you compare it to oxen, or you compare it to a donkey, or you compare it to a horse, it can carry much, much less. It can only carry about 60 pounds, so it's not much, and it can carry it for very short distances, okay? So it can't carry a plow. So what happens when the European breeds come in, they displace these animals, right? And that's part of the problem that we've had. But they're really cute, but there you go. And this exchange that we have from sort of the Americas to Europe and Europe to the Americas is known as the Colombian exchange. So certain things went over, and there's certain things that you would associate with certain cuisines in the world, and you think, well, it can't be, if we don't have that, like for instance, Italian cuisine, what would Italian cuisine be without the tomato? But that comes from the Americas, okay? And certain things came the other way, like honeybees, sugarcane, and tons of diseases. So we managed to send quite nasty stuff over to the Americas. So that's sort of all the ecology and so forth. And now what I want to do is really go really quite fast through sort of a bit of lovely pottery and sites of the Americas itself. I'm going to start at the very beginning, a bit like Mary Poppins, and then go all the way up to the Spanish colony. So the first, I told you that you have this maritime hypothesis, this very rich coastal area bringing in fish, and what you start getting are these huge sites, and this is the site of Caral, and this is at around 3,000 to 1,800 BC, what's known as the late pre-ceramic period, and you have monumentalization at a huge scale. So the site of Caral has got 16 of these pyramids in it, okay? They're probably built over a long period of time. And one thing that you have in the Americas, and we'll see this time and time again in the Andes, is what's called organic buildings. So that actually, when you look at something like this, which is one of the central pyramids of Caral, it's actually got 7 building phases inside. So you have, if you dig all the way down, you have a smaller temple, then they build another one, then they build another one, and so forth and so forth. So they're organic. They're constantly building on them, okay? So this is the site of Caral, and you can see all the different pyramids that are associated with it. Yet, there are no real settlements. So people come to these places, they pray, they have rituals, and then they go and live in their dispersed hamlets further away, okay? And this is another one of these pyramids at the site of Caral. It's truly astounding, and these are about 5,000 years old. So it's a lot of people that are being brought together to build these places. When we went to Machu Picchu, which is the first slide I showed you, if you remember, there would have been up to 20,000 people building that site over a year. So they could gather huge groups of working of working people to do these labors. Then beyond this early pre-ceramic, you start getting more agricultural sites, and then the start of ceramic. And the first major culture that we have is during what's known as the early Horizon. And what you have in the Americas is a division, in the Andes is a division between horizons and periods, intermediate periods. And the horizons is when one style sort of manages to go over a huge area of the Andes. And the intermediate periods is when you have a multitude of different styles of ceramic, okay? So the first major temple site that you have is this site called Chavin, which has a series of tenoned heads all around it. It is a very, very complex site. Its apogee was between 900 and 200 BC. It is probably a proselytizing cult that spreads across the Andes. And the site was actually used until the coming of the Spaniards. So it continued to be it continued in use for about 3,000 years. It's got a central monumental sculpture called the Lanzón, which I'll show you later on, which is probably a reflection of an agricultural and the jaguar cult. And it's probably, we know that by the late period, it is venerated as Wari, the god of agriculture. And this is the Lanzón itself. It is in the middle of the temple inside Chavin, and it is the oldest religious object to be in its position in the world. It's been there for 3,000 years, okay? And this, if you fold this out, this is what? This is the figure that you get, okay? And the shape is in the shape of a footplow. If you look at it, you can see where the foot would have gone down. So it's in the shape of a footplow, which is why we reckon that it was they were venerating the agricultural god. Okay? So that's the site of Chavin. We know that it was probably the main temple. It's not an empire, but it's a big temple amongst other temples which are copying its style. Okay? It's got internal galleries, it's got offerings, it uses sound, smoke, and lights to make the whole temple sort of a theater to religion. And there are analogous sites like Pacopampa, Cotush, etc., but they're much smaller in scale. This is the site. This is another one of these tenant heads, and this is the site itself, okay? And again, it's a site which has a new temple, an old temple, and different sunken courtyards. So it's something that evolves over time. It's not static. It's not that they do it in one fell swoop. It's not like the Sistine Chapel or something like that. It evolved over time. So once this horizon sort of collapses, you start getting into one of these intermediate periods, and what you have are different styles across the Andes. So this would be Moche, this would be Recuay, and this is Nazca, associated to the Nazca lines, those famous lines that you find in the desert. And we're talking really about the first states by this stage. Okay, and some of these states are quite violent, amongst the most violent, and this is something that next year we would be visiting these sites, are the Moche. And this is the god of the Moche called Aipec. And the Moche are really into their blood sacrifices and killing people and taking prisoners, and are really generally not very nice neighbors. So the Moche are in the northern coast. This is the Huaca de la Luna. They sort of inhabit these coastal valleys, and all their pottery, most of the pottery, they have these head vessels, but the other ones that they have are these line drawing vessels, which are very characteristic of the Moche. This is a pot which has been sort of, the archaeologists have sort of painted out. And what you have here is you have leader figures within it, and then a series of prisoners which are being taken to be sacrificed, right? And whenever we've dug Moche tombs, what we find is tons of sacrificed victims. And the other thing that we find, which is rather disgusting, is these cups, which are called queros, and we've done residue analysis on them, and the only thing it reacts to is human blood. So they're drinking human blood, okay? Because, you know, that's the way they rock. And you get, even in the palaces, you can see down here, it's a line of prisoners being taken to be sacrificed, okay? And this is a depiction of the Lord of Sipan, which would have been one of these Moche lords. This is the richest grave that has been found in the Americas. Okay, he was found with quite a number of sacrifice victims around him, and he had a huge amount of gold and silver on him. Okay, it's by far the richest tomb that we found. We found, what is interesting, I mean, they're an incredibly violent, incredibly militaristic society, but actually what's interesting is that women were also lords in the society. So their gender balance was very different to the one that's associated with the Spaniards, or in many cases associated to modern society. So women could also be lords in these societies. With the collapse of Moche, you get the start of empires, okay? So now we're in the Middle Horizon, another one of these sort of expansive phases. And here we actually now realize that we have two empires. We have the Wari on the one hand, Tiahuanaco on the one hand, which is from Lake Titicaca southwards, and the Wari, which is this big red area. And these, by this stage, we're coming onto really complex societies. So I told you that the Americas have been isolated for thousands of years. So the way it was described to me by an old professor of mine is that if we think that all humans have the same hardware, what you have to think is that different cultures have different software programs. So they think about and solve problems in different ways. And this is really interesting in the Americas when it comes to writing. So the ancient Americans don't have any form of writing. What they do have are these things, which are called quipus, which are knots and string, okay? And they could read them. And this starts in the Middle Horizon. The Incas then used them. Unfortunately, the Spaniards thought that this was the devil's writing, and they killed them, so we can't decipher them anymore. But we know that they encoded language. We know that they encoded numbers as well, so they were used to count, to sort of, for tax returns and so forth, because they were collating sort of produce. But we can't read them anymore. We're trying to find the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone of Quipu, but we haven't found it yet, right? But because we have texts where the Quipu readers are talking to a Spanish scribe who writes down what is encoded in the knots, but we don't, the knots don't survive. Okay, so we have the writing, but we don't have the knots that would have accompanied it, which is unfortunate. What you have by this stage is sort of really the sinews of empire. You start getting quite extensive fieldwork systems. These are raised field systems around Lake Titicaca. You have sort of planned cities. I hope that you can see that this is of a different type of building to what we had earlier on. We start getting roads, administrative centers, larger irrigation projects, these quipu. This gives you an idea of what these field systems look like. Some of them are still being used nowadays. It's absolutely amazing, some of this stuff, at least to me. So you have the Wari, which is the red blob up to the top, and Tiahuanaco, which is this empire that actually goes all the way down to sort of middle Chile. Okay, so they're huge. We're starting to get big populations. So the capital of Wari is estimated 20,000 to 40,000 people, 15 kilometers square, that's about 10 miles square. Tiahuanaco, probably its core is 15,000 to 20,000 people by about 80, 70. And we're talking about sort of 4 miles square. They're not an ideal site for cities, but as in the sense of for produce, but produce is brought to them. They are the centers of empires by this stage. Tiahuanaco tends to be much more monumental, whilst Wari is much more a city, like a labyrinth of lanes, a labyrinth of streets, of narrow streets and orthogonal cells that you can see up there. Wari iconography is much more individualized, so we reckon that Wari has probably got rulers, as in kings, whilst Tiahuanaco, if you look at the iconography, is much more diffuse, so we're probably looking at a sort of clergy or religious elite rather than individual kings, okay? I'm going through this very fast, I'm sorry. And this is what Wari, the center of Wari looks like, and this is what the center of Tiahuanaco looks like, okay? It's on a different, they're on a different scale to what comes before. Then after the collapse of these empires, you again get a series of smaller, more balkanized states. The northern coast, and we'll talk about this, becomes one entity, which is called the Chimu Kingdom, the Kingdom of Chimu. And then in the highlands, there's a collapse in the art form. So this is the sort of rubbish ceramic that they're producing, unfortunately. And the houses become much more basic because something is happening up in the highlands, and it's much more unstable. So you have these coastal kingdoms, but you have a sort of very balkanized highlands. But it's from this balkanized sort of fervent of different communities in the highlands that the Incas eventually arise, which is the biggest empire that you have in the Americas. Okay? This is, by this stage, the Spaniards come to Peru in the 16th century. By the end of this period, which is about 1400, there are people who you start getting oral histories of this. So we're getting closer to having an idea of how the people were organized, much better than in the past, okay? Chimu in the north is one of the strongest kingdoms that you have in Peru. It's the strongest before the coming of the Incas. They have the biggest adobe city ever built in the world. It's 12 miles square. It's got 16 palaces in it, okay? And each palace is probably to one king. So what tended to happen is they would have one palace, the king dies, they close the palace, they build another one. And they go on and on and on, okay? And it goes into the desert. Their textile, the textile and gold working that they have in Chimu is unparalleled. This is a shirt made out of cotton at the back, so it's a cotton base. And these things that you see there, blue, red, and green, are breast feathers of parrots brought from the jungle, okay? It uses over 3,000 feathers, okay? Only the breast feathers, so that's a lot of breastless feathered parrots. Then you have another kingdom just slightly further south, which is called the Kingdom of Ichma, or the Señorío de Ichma. And this one is important, not because of its size, it's not the biggest kingdom, but it is the biggest temple site. And this is where the modern city of Lima is. And it's got the most important oracle in the Americas on the coast, okay, in the Andes. So it is a place of pilgrimage where people from the highlands and from the coast would have congregated. And this sort of survives until today because the god that was being venerated at Pachacamac is Pachacamac himself, and that means he who makes and sustains the world. So he's the one that sustains the people, and he's the god of earthquakes, the one that controls earthquakes. And the modern day Jesus that's on the site is known as El Señor de los Milagros, the Lord of Miracles, the Jesus of miracles. And he also has the same powers. So when the Spaniards come in and they start evangelizing, they bring Catholicism, what they do is they take the local gods and they plonk either different Jesuses or different saints. And the one they put here is a saint of miracles, a Jesus of miracles. And that's it for the people before the Incas, and then we come on to the Incas, which are great. So the Inca Empire is divided into four: the northern Chinchaysuyu, the eastern Antisuyu, the Collasuyu, and the Kuntisuyu. The center of it is Cusco, which is up in the highlands. It is the biggest indigenous empire of the Americas. We're talking probably between 12 to 15 million inhabitants. It is over 2 million kilometers in size, over 770,000 square miles. It's huge. And it is the culmination of over 10,000 years of independent development. If you're looking at the independent development of civilization, South America is one of those centers. So you would have had Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. And that's it, okay? All the other civilizations are derived from those, okay? Their capital is the city of Cusco. And the city of Cusco, this is a map from the 19th century, but if you look at the Inca core of the city of Cusco, it is planned to look like a jaguar, okay? It is split into two halves, the bottom half and the top half, and unfortunately, where you would find the reproductive organs is where the central temple is, okay? The central temple of the empire, because that's where supposedly the fertility of the empire comes from. And the head is the site of Sacsayhuaman, which is a fortress temple site. When we go to Cusco, you'll see it. It's at the top of the hill. It's beautiful. So they have one of the most impressive road systems ever created in the ancient world. We're talking about nearly 25,000 miles of road, linking over 2,000 settlements, centers, inns known as tambos, storage facilities known as kolkas, and runner stations known as chasquihuasis. Chasquis were runners, were these people here, and they would have run with these quipu, with these messages on their hands. They would have had a shell trumpet, and they would have basically, if needed, they would have sprinted for about anything between 3 to 7 miles to the next runner station, and they would have blown the trumpet just before getting to the other one, so the other one would get ready to move the message forward. And it's not just messages that they sent. From Cusco, which is here, the Inca would have received fresh fish from the coast within 2 days by runner. Okay? A message from Quito, which is up there, which is that red spot at the very, very top. Let's see, that one down there, to Cusco would have taken 12 days. And these people were running because they didn't have horses, and you can't ride a camelid because you'll break its back. And in the Andes, so this is an Inca road, they were over-engineered, and then what they built were suspension bridges. The suspension bridges were supposedly invented in the 19th century. They were using them in the 16th century, in the 15th century, okay? And when the Spaniards first came, there was one particularly brutal conquistador called Benalcázar, who thought, because they were quite ignorant, who thought that these things were being held up by magic. So when he came, he would descend from his horse and crawl over the bridges, praying to God so that he wouldn't fall down, because he thought it was being held by black magic. So what we're looking at here is by this stage, we're looking at serious construction. So this is an Inca temple. Very characteristic of the Incas are trapezoidal entrances. So you have two types of construction. One is ashlar construction, which is this sort of square stone. And the other one, which is incredible, is this. This is polygonal construction. And this polygonal construction is used for the best buildings in Cusco, in the capital. And when you look at them, they look like jigsaw puzzles, and they're three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. And the way this would work is that when you have an earthquake, because we're in a very seismic region, these will rub against each other and settle back into position, okay? And the Coricancha, which is this massive temple at the center of Cusco, the Inca temple, there's been 3 major earthquakes since the Spaniards went there. The Spaniards put a church on top. The church has collapsed 3 times, and the temple is still there. And by this stage, we're looking at serious construction of cities. So this is what they borrowed from the Wari Empire beforehand. That's why I'm telling you that it's the culmination of years of development. So this is the Wari center, and these are the Inca centers at a much bigger magnitude, okay? And you have tons of these. Then, again, they are harnessing sort of human labor and animal labor. They have an economy based on this highland triad of the potato, maize, and camelids. They're getting these textiles, and they're also producing these terraces so that they can carry on producing for the empire. To take this all forwards, you need imperial centers, you need administrators. And for that, you need people that can read these knots. This would have been a quipu reader. He's got the knots in his hand. And you have state servants, known as yanaconas, and they also have colonists. They move people around the empire to colonize new areas. Okay, so this is a true sort of fully fledged empire. Like all the Andean people, they are animists, so they believe that the landscape is animated. So much so that Father Bernabé Cobo in 1653 said the Indians of Peru were so idolatrous that they worshipped as gods almost every kind of thing created. They would have worshipped stones, they would have worshipped the water, they would have worshipped these little figurines, they would have made some small effigies of gods. They think that the whole sort of, and the whole world is animated, and its animation, what gives it its strength is its oracular power, is what it tells the people about how to live their life and how to go forth in the world. Then there's also a big, and this is really interesting actually, there's a big cult to the dead. So the dead become sacred ancestors, which is why, and that's what I find interesting, it's so easy for Christianity to make, to sort of come into the Andean world. Because the way the Spanish priests sell it to them is that Jesus is one of these dead ancestors. And that fits into the Andean world vision very easily. And they can accept that. So they would have buried the dead in these types of constructions, which are little houses, and you can see that there's an entrance, because they would have taken the dead out at certain times of the year and communicated with them and fed them and taken care of them. And the dead were not quite dead. They were there, and you could speak to them and they could advise you. And so they're monuments to the dead, their interaction with the dead, and this also happens with the Incas themselves. So the Incas would be at the top of this sort of pyramid of sacred power. And then they also, and this again comes back to how in the Andes things are different and how people can come up with different ways of looking at the sky. So they also venerated the upper world. So the world is separated between what's called the Ananpacha, which is the world above, the Caipacha, which is the world here, and the Unapacha, which is the world below, and the Hakakpacha, which is the world beyond. And they would have looked at the sky, and we look at the stars, and we look at how Pisces, for instance, is the pattern made up in the skies. Well, in the Andes, it was completely the other way of looking at it. They would have looked at the dark patches made by the sky. So they would see not the stars themselves, but the dark areas in between. Okay? So again, it's a reverse of how we would think about it. Okay? And this is a depiction of the altarpiece in the Coricancha and the different things that they were venerating within it. So you've got the lakes, man and woman, the rainbow, the sun, the moon, Pleiades, etc., etc., etc. Okay? And again, everything was alive. So the center of the empire is the Coricancha. This is a church that has collapsed 3 times. And below it, all this is the Inca temple, still there. And from here, they would have radiated sort of pilgrimage lines throughout the whole of the empire, linking different temples like these onto the center, which was a way of exerting sacred control over the empire, okay? And they would have venerated, the Inca Empire venerated Viracocha as the creator god, and then Inti as the sun, his brother, Inti Iyalpa, and Punchao, which is the morning sun. Okay, these were the 4 major deities, but then they would have venerated everything else as well. So, and the Inca Empire didn't last that long, but you would have, what we know is that there were probably this number, about 12 Incas, although we do know that the Incas tended to be quite brutal within themselves and killed quite a few of themselves. But anyway, these are the Incas. You would have had a lower house and an upper house, and each one would have had its own household, which are called panagas. Okay? But the important thing is, as I told you before, when you die, you don't quite die. So the last Inca that we have, which is the 2 brothers, Huasca and Atahualpa, who sort of went into a civil war, would have had to consult all the other dead Incas before taking a decision, because they were living in death. Okay? And for anybody who comes down to South America next year, I'll explain it in more detail. So we're now coming to the end. So at the very end, we get the European invasion. And the European invasion succeeds so well because the Inca Empire is already at a crisis point. So you have one Inca, you have this individual, Huayna Capac. He is the last undisputed Inca. He dies. His designated heir dies, and I'll tell you now what they die of. And then the only ones which are, then it's 2 other brothers which fight it out, which are Huasca and Atahualpa. And this is taken from portraits from the 16th century, and it's interesting because you can tell who drew this portrait. And the one who drew this portrait was obviously in Camp Huasca and not Camp Atahualpa, because you get Huasca, 13th Inca, and then you get the tyrant and bastard Atahualpa. So obviously, this is Team Huasca that did this drawing. Unfortunately, so these two battle it out, Atahualpa in the north, Huasca in the south. And actually, the reason that the father and the designated heir die is because we're around the 1520s by this stage. The Spaniards have already got to Mexico. They're still trying to come down to South America because they've heard that of El Dorado, of a land of gold. But what comes before the Spaniards to Peru is disease. So the disease vectors go from tribe to tribe through the Panama Canal, through Colombia, through Ecuador, and hit the Inca Empire. So Huayna Capac and his designated heir are fighting in the north, and they both succumb most likely to smallpox. Okay? So what you have is you have then this Inca civil war erupting, you have this disruption of Inca leadership, and then the Spaniards come. There is this disparity in the weapons that they're using. The Incas are using maces, the Spaniards are using guns and cannon. And the other thing is that the Inca Empire was still expanding. So there were still quite a lot of people who hadn't been under the Incas for that long, and they move over to the Spaniards. So it's a combination of fickle allies and then revenge by other groups, thinking that they can use the Spaniards against the Inca. Little did they know that the Spaniards, at the hands of Pizarro, was the vanguard of a massive colonization project, which brought down an empire. And Pizarro, very, very early on, captures Atahualpa. By this stage, Atahualpa has killed his brother, Huáscar, and once he captures Atahualpa, he takes over the empire. Okay? And then the Spaniards themselves descend into civil war between themselves because Peru is quite rich. But then what really brings the empire down is a combination of disease and death. So there's epidemics, smallpox epidemics in 1524 to 25, in the 30s, 57, 66, 82, 85. An estimated 48% of the population declines because of smallpox. They also have measles, typhus, pneumonic plague. It's quite nice. Influenza, mumps. The conquistadors themselves start fighting against each other, and they use the Amerindian population as proxies. And then there's social displacement, because the other thing that the Spaniards are after are the mines. They find the richest silver mine that the world has ever seen, which is in Potosí, which is in Bolivia. Life expectancy in the mines of Potosí was 5 years. But you need a counterpart to the silver mine, and that's the mercury mine. Life expectancy in the mercury mine was 2 years. They would press gang young men to take them to the mines, to the extent that in some of the communities, when they had a child and it was a boy, they would cut the hand off because they knew that then they wouldn't be press ganged into the mines. Okay? So, that's a happy end to the story. So, nevertheless, there has been a revival since then. So you get people like Martín Chambi, which is one of the most famous Peruvian photographers, and he really does a lot. He's photographing in the 20s and 30s. He does a lot to sort of build a romantic image of sort of the Inca past, and that's him there. Then there's philosophers like José Carlos Mariátegui. Then you get these sort of independence movements of the 1700s and 80s, which again are vindicating the Incas. And nowadays, in a much more tourist-friendly way, is the return of Inca sort of ceremonies. So that if you go to Cusco, you can participate in the Inti Raymi, Sun Festival, the Capac Raymi, and the Pachamama festivals, right? And with that, I leave you all, and hopefully I'll see some of you next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That was brilliant, and I love that group photo. That's wonderful. Does anybody have any questions for Kevin? Or did he teach you everything you need to know?
Sorry that I went too fast through it, but...
I'll come and bring you, and then you were next.
You were talking about mining for silver and mercury. What did they use the mercury for?
The mercury, when you extract the silver, it's not silver, it's ore. So you need the mercury to cut, to divide the silver from the earth, basically. And it's incredibly toxic. And I don't think they had 21st century health and safety regulations in place at the time. I've been to the silver mine. It's horrendous. It is absolutely horrendous. All around it, there's cemeteries. There's, I mean, this is apocryphal, but they say that from the silver from Potosí, which is this massive silver mine, you could have built a bridge to Madrid, right? But you could have built a bridge to Madrid and back off the bones of the people that died in the mine. Well, mercury poisoning, starvation. The people were kept for 5 years under the earth, basically, working until they killed them. Collapsing, yeah, all that sort of stuff. For instance, Potosí is an incredible city. At one point, it was the biggest city in the world. And the governor of Potosí, one governor of Potosí, when he got married, so you've got the governor's house and you've got the cathedral here, so that when he got married, he had the cobblestones for one day from the governor's house to the cathedral put in silver ingots, so that him and his wife could walk over silver ingots to get married.
You touch on so many different things. My mind is going in 1,000 places. Let me just go in one tiny place. Around the world, and I love architecture. I didn't see the stone in the middle of the arch.
There's no arch. They didn't produce the arch. That's why they have trapezoidal entrances. They don't have the arch. But they do have, that's why they have a trapezoidal with a lintel, with a strong lintel at the top. They didn't have stone bridges because this is so seismic, the region, that's why they had the hanging bridges, which are made out of grass, roped grass. There's only one community that still has one of these hanging bridges, and they need to make it every year. And there's 2 villages, one on each side, and every year they chuck it down, and then they rebuild the bridge.
We have a question here from Eric.
And then Siri down here.
Did they have a written language? What is the history of their writing?
Sorry, come again?
Did they have a written language?
No, they didn't. They only had these quipu, these knots on string. So the written language only comes with the Spanish alphabet, and that comes in the 16th century. So when you start getting the first Indians which are taught Spanish, they start using the Spanish alphabet to write in Quechua and in Aymara, which are their local languages. But there was no written language. It was these knots on string, which we can't decipher in the vast majority. Siri.
Kevin, one of the many, many fascinating things you taught us when we were there was about the Incas' understanding and knowledge of astronomy and the stars, and how they aligned roads so at certain times of year the stars. And I'm wondering if you could just say something about that, because it just was phenomenal, their understanding.
So they tended to, because they believed that the whole landscape was alive and the whole of sky was alive, so it was all an entity that was vibrant and alive. They tended to use also the stars and the sun to be able to map the seasons of the year, so that they would align, for instance, certain buildings so that the sun would hit the wall at certain points, so that they would know when they needed to start sowing the certain crops and when they needed to take the crops out. So no, it's an incredibly complex system of astronomical observation to be able to regulate the year. And what's interesting is actually, this is really good, they had a decimal system way before decimal systems were in use in Europe, and they had regulated the year to 365 days, so they were very close. to the year as we would understand it. So no, it was, by the time you get to the Incas, it's incredibly complex. I mean, unfortunately, it's not an unknown civilization, but we know so little about it because the Spaniards destroyed so much in so little time. The decrease in the population was astronomical. So there was 48% decrease in population in the first sort of 20 years. In the first 100 years of contact, it's 90%. Right? The population of the Andes, of the Inca Empire was between, as I said, 12 to 15 million. By the 19th century, there was only 1.5 million. Right? So this is 300 years later, it still hadn't recovered. It only recovers in the 20th century.
One question. What can we bring as American tourists that would be helpful to them? And I don't mean MONEY. Just truly, I try to take things in different places of the world. I mean, and rooms and things like that. But how do we be good Americans?
It's hard. It's a really hard one. When I've gone, for instance, I always try to work with the kids as much as possible. So I take pencils. I take stuff for school. So I tend to take pencils, pens, rubber, erasers, etc. So I tend to take those kinds of things. Definitely not sweets, but things that they can use. Flashlights. All that sort of stuff that I find really useful. And they really like receiving those.
Kevin will be out there in case you have any questions, more questions. Kate, would you like to ask one last question?
I'm really sorry. Tell me.
This is a nice review of all your slides.
Oh. That's not stone. These are raised field systems. Okay, these are these. This is what you get on a aerial photograph. These are rectangular ones, and these are round ones. And what you have here, this is at very, very high altitude. Okay, so there's a tendency, if you had an open field, it would freeze. Okay, and the crops would freeze and you would lose them. If you have water beside it, it actually ameliorates the temperature by as much as 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So what you do is that you raise the field in between, and you have water flowing around it. So you lose land, but you gain productivity. Okay? Sorry? These are usually beside the lakes, and then they're filtering water through. I'll show you, actually. So the lake is just over here, and you can see the canals. Do you see them? And then they build the fields on each side. And you can get 2 crops out of these per year, but you can only use them for about 2-3 years, and then they have to stay fallow 15 to 20 years. Yeah. These are found normally around Lake Titicaca, and this is at about 13,000 feet. Okay? But it's huge. I mean, it's huge areas of these. They are working into recovering some of these. The thing is, you can't put machinery over these. These are quite narrow. These are about 1/2 meter. It's not much more than that. This one? As in, how big would this be? This is probably about 30 yards, so 90 feet from one end to the other. Sorry, I'm changing from metric to imperial.
Well, please join us for some South American taste treats and some refreshments outside. Thank you, Kevin, very much.
Thank you very much.